Uh, there's a lot that we need to do. Build a lot of infrastructure still in India. Nirmala Sitharaman has said that they are going to espouse the cause of sustainable finance in this G20 meet. Now, given India's developmental needs, is it really a feasible kind of promise? We have seen Prime Minister Modi go to Paris conference, promise a certain date, and then come back and prevaricate on that. Of course, we understand because there are developmental needs and concern. So I would like to address this question to Mr. Sandeep as to whether this is really possible.
Yeah, thanks. It's a little tricky question. It's easy and as well as good as difficult. Well, any sustainable program, whether it is development and more so in the public domain, needs to be inclusive, needs to get a buy-in in terms of all stakeholders to foster the collaboration amongst all the people. And more important than that, it is, people should be ready to adapt to innovation, because on the way you will meet innovation. You cannot plan innovation today, because when you learn, experience, you get innovation. So first is that you define your framework based on this. And I think more or less the G20s up to now have more or less defined those frameworks. And India has some very unique change enablers. So, you have to leverage those change enablers. And we have some constraints. So we have to mitigate those constraints. So in terms of change enablers, the few change enablers that we have are our MSMEs, which are the small and medium-sized companies. And so you take any project, even Mission on Mars. I was in Hungary that time, and that project had so many vendors, and one small chip was made from that country. And that was also an MSME in the EU, but for an Indian project. So MSME is one of the key things. Then democratization of the digitalization. This is where India has picked up speed, and this is where we can leverage that. And the third and the most important thing is you should use the fervor for all the green transition in our favor to demand, both internally as well as externally, in terms of sustainable finance. Now, what are the constraints? Constraints is traditionally all the large projects, if you have seen in the public domain, are financed by World Bank and the Government of India, or by JBIC, the Japanese Bank of International Cooperation. The traditional model has been that. And I have myself worked, and I can tell you from my personal experience, that in 2003, I used to do bill passing as a CA for one MNC, and DMRC was our client. So, I could imagine the plight of our money used to come late, then we used to pay the MSMEs so late. So, everything used to, and still you see the Delhi Metro today or all the metros today, you see the difference that has made to our life today. So, for sustainable finance, MSME, India has made a big progress. How many of you are aware about trade receivable discounting? Have you heard about it in your curriculum? Or, of course, some of the finance professionals would be aware. But trade receivable discounting is one of the key enabler that India should leverage in G20. There are similar platforms available globally in some advanced countries, but this will help both the Indian MNCs or the large Indian corporates who are doing exports from India, as well as who have subsidiaries abroad. So I have worked in a subsidiary abroad. I know that I have to get a parent company guarantee or a standby letter of credit to get limits in a third country. It is a very arduous process. So instead of that, here in the trade receivable system, what happens is that there is an MSME, there is a corporate, which is the buyer. The MSME supplies to the buyer. Wherever it is located becomes immaterial because of the platform. The bills of the MSME are put on the platform. The banks, who are the financiers, they buy those bills at a certain discount, which can be borne by the corporate and the MSME jointly, or maybe largely by the corporate. Depending on the credit rating of the corporate, the discount is also very less. It hardly works out to 6 or 7%, which is a very good rate of finance for the MSME. Because they will, if they go for borrowing on their balance sheet and take a loan, it will be around 12 to 14%. So it gives them a lot of savings, and it gives them money on day one. So this is how I think India should leverage its change enablers effectively for the sustainable finance. Because unless you pay people, work will not happen very fast. Now the third thing, what are the constraints? As I talked about commercial finance. Now, when somebody gives you commercial finance, we should not have roadblocks. Now our policy implementation and project management has been a challenge. Now you are seeing the complete dispute in terms of RA, car metro shed. And similar, I don't want to get into the specifics of each project, but largely if you see these projects get delayed. Now who pays for that? All of us, the taxpayers. All the interest and all the escalations which go into the pocket of the foreign bank or the financer is from our pocket. The politician or the political party get their so-called political dividend and they walk away. But it's the common man who suffers. So this is where I think the project discipline needs to be installed. There has to be a common minimum agreement or some kind of a legal security in the way projects are handled in India, where once a government, whichever it is, state government, central government or any government, the project should not get defined by the political ideology or the political requirement of the party in power. So I think that is one of the key aspects that we need to keep in mind. A few other things that Nirmala Sitharaman ji, I can only request her, I'm too small a person to tell her. I can only say that as any finance people, we always do these two things, which even I think Sakshi would agree, is that we see how we are going to get the fund, and from the deployed project, how are we going to collect the money? These are the only two things. This is the simple principle I am saying. So in this, what needs to be done is that when you collect the funds, today you go to banks, you go to other things, it increases our national borrowings. One way is that you have heard about the Oxfam report. How many of you have read newspaper for Oxfam report? Okay, Oxfam report came recently in some of the newspapers. So they said very clearly that a large percentage of the wealth of a very few Indians is held with a few people. Whereas, I'm just giving a very simple, I don't want to get into numbers and all. And a very large percentage of people hold a balanced wealth. So I think this is the inequality. Now, when I say inclusiveness, it cannot have such inequality, correct? So how can that inclusiveness be brought? Is by doing the right sourcing. So there are three incomes today which unfortunately, fortunately are not really taxed properly. What are those three incomes? The three incomes are income which are earned without efforts. One is the dividend. So you can imagine people who have lakhs of rupees of shares or crores of rupees of shares. Okay, there are a few people like that who get tons of dividends, who get tons of capital gains. Now, our current government policy since beginning, and even with all the improvements that we have done in the last 8-9 years, still the deduction under 54 EC is only 50 lakhs. My question is why? Because I read a report recently in the newspaper of Tata Motors. There was a very funny thing that electric buses, if they are deployed, it will lead to a green transition. Everybody agrees? Because it will save the fuel and will be more efficient in terms of the energy utilization and carbon emissions. So from that perspective, if I want to invest in that project, if Tata Motors doesn't want to bid for the project, it's a cause of worry for us as an Indian, because the fact that the payments are slow. So how this can change? And all this money which is in the hands of the large capital gains and the dividend holders is taxed, and they should be given an option to invest that money in bonds. So it is a very cheaper way to get finance. So if today the person makes a capital gain, say 10 crores, he gets 50 lakhs only as a saving by investing in infrastructure bonds. If I raise that limit to say 2 crores or 5 crores, which is what a government should do, that money will come to the government for a longer period. The rate of the bond can reduce, because otherwise the person has to pay tax at 10 or 20%. So he will prefer to invest in the bond. So if an average borrowing is at 5% or 6%, here the coupon can be 2 or 3%, which will be at an international rate. So I think this is the way we can leverage both our strengths as well as our tax laws to change the way we collect funds. Now it comes to deployment. When it comes to deployment, government has been lenient to cut GST. Thank you so much. At the same time, we are not seeing a lot of change in terms of going for the electric vehicles. There are some inhibitions people have in mind in terms of charging milega. Will I get lot of support in terms of battery? There have been reports of the batteries going fat. So all these things lead to slowness. Now, if it leads to slowness, are we meeting our sustainability goals which we have promised to the World Bank and to the G20? We'll be slow, no? to some extent. So how do we do that? So the way I think we should approach in the G20 fora is that we should say that whatever taxes are levied, now they are not vatable by the common people who buy. Okay, companies also buy, I'm not sure it can be vatable, but what we can do is there can be a token deduction. Now deduction is given in the Income Tax Act for a loan taken to buy an electric vehicle. It is not given for the GST you pay on the electric vehicle. So to that extent, you should not finance the entire GST. To that extent, a person takes a car, which is an electric car, he should be given some amount of a GST refund in his income tax return over a phase period of 3 years. And government can run this scheme for the next 2 years. You don't have to be a lifetime scheme. So, the next 2 years is where we all want all the change. This is where our transport minister is saying that by 2025, all vehicles will become electric vehicles. How? It cannot happen because Modi hai to mumkin hai. It will happen because everybody wants that to happen, and that's where the inclusiveness and the collaborative efforts have to come. And this is where I think all the tax laws need to be thought over from that perspective. The budget is nearby. And I think if all citizens feel that this is how it can happen, your voice will be heard. So I think this is one thing. Second is that in terms of making the transition, one has to understand that today a lot of energy that India consumes today is coal power, largely. So it has to move to a solar power or renewables and such energy projects. And all this change can happen only when the source of funding is cheaper, the deployment is proper, the returns are calculated, because it's end of the day, it's all a P&L. So all this happens. Yes, definitely I feel that India can do better in terms of sustainability, and we wish that the current government is actually doing many things which are good for the country, and I think they should look at these aspects and try and make a change.
Thank you, sir. Just as a trivial joke, sustainability will happen if the loans are repaid. And there was a study which was done by NABARD, and it wanted to understand the loan repayment pattern of primary cooperative societies across all Indian states. And they found that the highest loan repayment rate is in Kerala. And they wanted to find out what is the reason why people, why such high repayment rates. They realized that at that primary level, if a person defaults, all the women in that area, they go to his house with brooms and they tell him that please repay your loan back. Because of that, it was 100%. So, the power of women micro entrepreneurs, and G20 is talking about women-led development, and I would